with the Book of Kings, we know pretty well, more or less, when it was written, because it tells the history down to a certain point. The main debate about that is whether it was then updated a little bit to bring it up to the release of the king from the Babylonian prison. But it obviously came at the end of the period of the kingdoms.
Yeah.
Now, then we find the books of Chronicles, which go over pretty much the same ground, except they start back a little bit further with David. Now, they end, in this case, how far down does it come?
You know, how far does it start, or how far does it
Well,
go?
it starts back with David, but then it comes, I think, it at least includes mention of the Persians, which would indicate that it's no earlier than the Persian period.
Sure.
And people have disputed in recent years, could it be as late as the Greek period?
In any case, it's pretty far away from. It's far away from what it's describing.
Yeah.
Which is, you know,
Yeah.
maybe further away certainly than the Deuteronomistic history was, than Kings and Samuel.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, it feels like, even as it quotes liberally, it feels like a world away.
Yeah.
You know, so roughly when would you date Chronicles? I mean,
Well, the books that are most like Chronicles are Ezra and Nehemiah. And I figure they're 4th century.
yep.
So somewhere in the 300s.
So we're then, you know, what, a good 250, 300 years later
than Kings.
Yeah.
And they're suddenly feeling impelled to go back over the same ground. And why?
Right. So why would they feel the need to do it? But also, what does it tell us about the status of the book of Samuel and Kings, that they can sort of be, I mean, on the one hand, they're being totally rewritten. On the other hand, those are the books that are being rewritten, right? Like,
That's right. And you know, this whole phenomenon of rewriting the Bible. Now, some people would speak of this as a whole genre in itself. We get a lot of other compositions that are like it. Now, I suppose the first thing to be said is other people rewrote their literature too.
sure.
Because, you know, just like on television, they like to do remakes. It's much easier, in a way, to write your story if you're adapting a story that has already been written.
Sure.
And that, I think, is part of it. But in this case, there is surely a clear agenda. Because what do they do with the older stories in this case?
Well, so what they do is essentially sanitize.
Yes.
I mean, this is
Yes.
particularly clear in First Chronicles,
Yeah.
which is largely the story of David. If you have read David in the book of Samuel, you are looking at a guy who, you know, has conflict with Saul and conflict with you know, the northern kingdom, and whose kids are fighting, and you have the deaths of Amnon, and you have Absalom, and and people are dying all around him.
Who
and,
has a man murdered so that he can take his
Bathsheba, and I mean, it's a dramatic human story of all of these ups and downs, and he's kicked off the throne, and you know, he comes back, and if you read Chronicles, you would know zero, like none, like literally none of that. Not a single word of any of it is in there. In Chronicles, Saul dies, and David just becomes king, and David dies, and Solomon just becomes king.
And you know, this God had indicated this to David, and David indicated it to everybody, and there was no dispute about it.
Totally fine.
You know, I'm reminded when you wrote your book on David, in which you highlighted some of his less savory characteristics. We had a student here at the time who told me that she told her mother about this. And her mother shook her head and said, no, sweetie. David was a man after God's own heart.
Yep.
It says so right here.
That's right.
I think that's kind of the mentality of the book of Chronicles.
Yeah, and so it's interesting, not just that David is sanitized, but there's still, you know, you would think, well, what do you do with the David? How do you have a David story once you take all of that stuff out? That's the whole story. And Chronicles goes on chapter after chapter about David, but essentially fills him out with a completely different set of material.
Well, the striking thing is that it makes David into a liturgist.
Primarily.
Pretty much.
And an architect. And I mean,
yeah.
So we have to be clear, right? What it does is it takes the notion from Samuel of David saying, I'd like to build a temple, and God saying, no, your son's going to do that. And Chronicles says, yes, fine. Solomon builds the temple, like puts physical brick on brick. Yeah. But literally everything else is David. David gives him the blueprints, right? Designs it, gives him the blueprints, sets up the priesthood, sets up, and then big, all this material about David setting up, as you said, the liturgy, right? The worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem. David institutes the sacrifices and the singing and the instrument playing and the prayers and all of this. And then Solomon just sort of has to, like make the Legos. Where does all of that stuff come from?
Well, the point they're trying to make is that this was the whole purpose of the temple from the beginning, even back before Solomon. So it's common to imply that earlier is somehow more fundamental, more important. And by pushing all of this stuff back to David, you're saying it was nobody ever thought of this any other way. This is how it's supposed to be. So that, I think, gives us a pretty good idea as to what kind of people wrote Chronicles. Mm-hmm. That there were people around the temple, Levites, perhaps. You get an awful lot of Levites in Chronicles. So people who thought that the whole purpose of the cult in Jerusalem was to keep the temple running smoothly and have all the appropriate music and choirs and everything else. And they foist all of that back on David.
And it's useful to point out that whereas Samuel and Kings are stories about kings doing king-like things because they're written in a period of kings, Chronicles is written in what's known as the Second Temple period, which is to say after the return from exile, when there is no kingship anymore.
There is no kingship.
So the power center of the nation, as it were, is now located in the priests in the temple. So for them to imagine David, right? Essentially, they've taken David as ancestor and like founder of the royal line, and made David into the ancestor and founder of the priestly line, or the priestly role, or the temple.
Pretty much. There's a very interesting parallel, or maybe precedent for this, in Ezekiel 40 to 48. Mm-hmm. Because Ezekiel 40 to 48 is an idea, it's a utopian vision. And there is a role for the figure who is called the prince, that we would otherwise call the king. Mm-hmm. But his job essentially is to provide for the cult.
Yeah.
That's really the only thing. There's no question of him leading an army or expanding the territory or anything like that. His job is just to see that there are sufficient provisions for the cult. And that's really the way it comes out here now in Chronicles too. Mm-hmm. So it's not really a real role for a king. Now, that leaves us, I think, with one interesting problem. And that is, you have in the books of Samuel the promise made to David. Mm-hmm. Now, the promise made to David was that one of his sons would always sit on the throne. And this worked for a long time. You would figure that the original draft of that must have been quite early, at a point when really the question was whether the line of David would get to occupy the throne. It is inconceivable, I think, that the promise to David was invented after the fall of the Davidic dynasty.
Sure.
But now along comes Chronicles, and what are they going to do with that? Now, we can look at the passage here. It's in 1 Chronicles 17:14. Moreover, I declare to you, the Lord will build you a house. It's been following Samuel here quite faithfully. When your days are fulfilled, to go to be with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be a father to him, he will be a son to me, but I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. Now, the one variation there from the older account is, he will establish him in my house.
Yeah.
And where is that?
Yeah.
The temple.
God only lives in one place.
Yeah. So, in effect, I think the promise to David has been transferred into the temple.
Yeah. I mean, again, like we have talked about how the temple was built as a royal temple, right? The connection between monarchy and the temple in Jerusalem was always very close. Yeah. It is really interesting that the restoration of the temple, the second temple, sort of replaces, it becomes the stand-in for the institution of the monarchy itself. They've actually become more closely fused, but there's simply not a royal figure anymore.
Yeah, there's one other little detail in First Chronicles that deserves comment, I think, and that is when David, actually one of the few things that anyone is said to do that maybe they shouldn't have done is take the census. But Chronicles has an explanation for it. Satan arose. Who's Satan and where did he come from?
It's a terrific question because, for all of the ubiquity of Satan in post-biblical and contemporary thought, this is not a common biblical figure. Is this the same sort of Satan, like adversary as we find in Job? Somebody who's like part of the divine realm, whose job it is to sort of tweak humanity a little bit to test it? Maybe. I mean, this is not, Yeah, right.
Which is also in the Persian period.
Right.
And in that case, too, again, he is somebody who's trying to cause trouble in a way, maybe to test. In that case, his target is the high priest, but he's a troublemaker.
Right. But he's not like the incarnation of evil.
No.
And so this would seem to be simply another occasion of, this was a story that looked not great for David in the original. Yeah. And so we're sanitizing it by making it not David's fault. But this story had to remain, right? As opposed to all of the stories of Bathsheba and all the internal political conflict that Chronicles just erases. This story of the census, he's got to keep because it's actually a story about the temple. Right? The census story is what leads to the purchase of the threshing floor from Ornan, and therefore the site of the temple. So this is you can see, like, I have to keep this story. If I've got to keep it, how am I going to make it so it doesn't look so bad for David?
Now, it is also, of course, a step in the development of Satan. Mm-hmm. It's a case where what Satan does is cast as bad, even though it may have had some reasonably good outcomes as well.
Sure.
So, what does it say then about 1 Kings, if you rewrite it like that? Is this an affirmation of its authority? Or is it saying, this thing needs to be replaced?
So, I mean, for me, the question is always, do I think that the people responsible for Chronicles thought to themselves, you should read this alongside
Kings.
the earlier version in Kings? Almost impossible to imagine, actually, I think, that Chronicles was meant to be read as like a companion volume.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you brought up which is to say, my suspicion is that Kings had not reached some sort of, it might have been authoritative, but not sacred. I mean,
Yeah.
it wasn't biblical,
So
to
this
speak.
isn't like rewriting the Torah,
Right.
which people will do in time. And in fact, maybe people were already doing by this time.
Yeah, it's a really interesting comparison because I think about texts like Jubilees,
Yeah.
which rewrites Genesis
Yeah.
and part of Exodus, which I suspect was written in a time when those texts had achieved an authority and was kind of meant to be read alongside, or at least wasn't meant to replace.
We think, yeah. We
But
think.
the line seems relatively thin there.
Yeah. Maybe we'll come back to that at the end of the next session.